Good afternoon, colleagues. I guess we can start with this panel. As you know, the title of the session is how to maintain relevance of the BTWC. This is obviously a title, but this is also a kind of overarching question that is on everybody's mind a few days away of the review conference of the BTWC. And when I say on everybody's mind, I mean mainly the small but very efficient BTWC community, which is very directly involved in the preparations or in the reflection ahead of the BTWC review conference next week in Geneva. I am also sure that our distinguished speakers will do their best to address this overarching and very topical indeed question about how to translate the discussions and the huge preparatory work already done ahead of the review conference into concrete action and concrete common understanding at the review conference itself. We count very much, of course, on your active participation and incentive to this debate, which will follow the presentations of our keynote speakers. Let me now very shortly introduce our keynote speakers. We will start by Tatiana Novosiolova from the University in Bradford, UK, who will speak about the key challenges before the BTWC as identified during the preparatory process, namely during the two preparatory committee sessions that took place during the week, and to speak, of course, about the review conference, how the review conference is expected, in fact, to deal with these key challenges and key issues identified already by the PrepComs. After her, Ajay Lele from the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in India will elaborate a little bit further on a specific topic, that is science and technology developments relevant to the BTWC and their possible impact on the BTWC and especially on the review conference. And last but obviously not least, Jean-Pascal Zanders from la Fondation de Recherche Stratégique France will present his views about some practical progress achieved by the state parties ahead of the, not ahead especially, but in principle, in the context of the BTWC and his possible impact, let's hope a positive impact on the proceedings of the review conference itself. You know that further information about our speakers can be found on the conference's app. Before giving the floor to our distinguished speakers, let me introduce myself very shortly. I am Emil Kazakov, a Bulgarian diplomat serving with the EES since 2011. I've been first posted in the EU delegation to the OEC in Vienna since 2015, when I moved to Brussels in the Non-Proliferation Disarmament Division, where I am dealing with BTWC among other issues. With this, let me give the floor to Tatiana for her presentation.
Thank you so much, distinguished chair, and thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for showing up to our panel. I hope that it will be interesting, and I really want to thank the organizers for having me here and for giving me the chance to talk a little bit about biological disarmament. It's definitely something that me and the organization that I represent, the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom, have been actively involved over the past more than 20 years now, when we first started working on strengthening the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. And ever since, we have been actively participating in the process. We have, in preparation for the 8th Review Conference, we have also produced a comprehensive document, key points, that have been submitted to all the diplomats and the office for Disarmament Affairs in Geneva for the attention to the president-designate of the 8th Review Conference as well. And the purpose of the key points is to outline main issues and the main issues that state parties, we hope, would address during the 8th Review Conference, and outlining as well recommendations and realistic and effective actions that can be taken on any of those issues. In my remarks, what I'm going to address are some of the key issues that have been discussed by state parties throughout the preparatory committee meetings that took place over the course of 2016. One, I want to begin by making one key observation, and that is that state parties for this review conference, for the 8th Review Conference, have never been better prepared. They've dedicated a lot of time. There was a two-fold preparatory committee meeting process in April and in August, and at which a lot of working papers and other documents have been submitted, and a number of issues have been identified. One of the issues that has been discussed is the need for restructuring the intersessional program, and that is one of the issues that state parties address on numerous occasions, and working papers have also been submitted. And structural changes are required mainly for facilitating effective action. And one such change could be the annual meeting of state parties to be given decision-making powers. And that is something that is not without a precedent, because if we look at the 2015 meeting of state parties, at that meeting, state parties actually make a decision to have this two-fold preparatory committee meeting process. Another key issue that has been on numerous occasions addressed during the intersessional process, and as indeed, not only during the intersessional process, but also during the preparatory committee meetings, and 7 working papers have been submitted on this issue solely, that is the need for institutionalized process for review of science and technology. This is something that if we look at the intersessional process, state parties haven't dedicated that much time addressing, unfortunately, this issue. So a more constructive and inclusive and effective process is necessary. One such option would be the establishment of an open-ended working group that is both inclusive and effective for addressing developments and reviewing developments in science and technology. Such an open-ended working group would comprise potentially not only scientific experts, but also diplomats and policymakers to enable wider participation. Third, another issue that has been discussed and that has emerged during the preparatory committee meetings is the need for providing reassurance the state parties are actually implementing the convention on a national level, and that is related to the standing agenda item of the intersessional process 2012-2015 on national implementation. Indeed, a number of working papers called for strengthening national implementation, and there is even one working paper that has been submitted by that has 14 depositories cross-regionally that demonstrates how reassurance can be achieved by demonstrating transparency and implementing the convention nationally. So to facilitate that process, a second open-ended working group could be established, and that will be tasked specifically with issues to address how state parties can best provide reassurance by implementing the convention nationally. So you can see that the proposals that we have in place here are really for strengthening and institutionalizing the processes within the framework of the BTWC, something that has been missing to date. Another key issue would be the need for enhancing the CBM, the confidence building measures process, and that would include broader participation, more active participation, potentially further revising the forms where necessary if state parties so decide, and also further developing the electronic facility that was launched last year and that was funded by the European Union. To that end, a technical working group could be set up, and that technical working group could be tasked with those responsibilities to help and further strengthen this process. Another key issue that is still standing is the need for universalization of the convention. And to that end, one way this can be promoted, this objective could be further promoted, is also by institutionalizing within the convention, but by establishing a steering committee. And that steering committee could comprise the chair and vice chairs of the annual meetings, together with the chairs of the two open-ended working groups and the technical committee. And that steering committee could be then tasked with and responsible for promoting the action plan on universalization, and could also progress the plan in regard to accessions to the 1925 Geneva Protocol and the withdrawal of any remaining reservations that state parties may have. And finally, another key issue that has been long discussed and that has been also discussed during the 7th Review Conference of the BTWC is the need for enhancing the resources for the implementation support unit. Those of you familiar with the setting and with the implementation support unit would know that this is a three-people office, which is currently tasked with providing secretarial support for the convention. One practical proposal to that regard could be the enhancement of resources by adding 3 more additional posts. That would be a P4 for science and technology, a P4 political officer for the open working and group on providing reassurance, and a P3 political officers who deal with the technical working group on CBMs. And when we calculated the resources required for such an enhancement of the ISU, it turned out that the whole budget, that annually the contributions necessary from states parties would be 4.5% of what states parties normally pay to the OPCW for the Chemical Weapons Convention. So in a way, they can get a lot of institutional and support and better support at a very low cost compared to what they normally would pay for the Chemical Weapons Convention. And we can see that the challenges that the BTWC faces are not any less significant than those faced by the Chemical Weapons Convention. So that can result in a stronger CBW regime altogether. And with that, I would end my remarks and would hope for questions in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for this comprehensive overview of the key issues to be dealt with during the review conference. And from the broader picture, let us now move to a specific area of interest, which is the science and technology. Ajay, the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank the organizers for inviting me and giving an opportunity to speak on this extremely important occasion, because we are going to have within few days the review conference coming up. Let me start. It's not correct to start talk in the evening on US elections, but let me start to talk with the US elections. A very simple point, that 7th review conference we had opening remarks which was given by Mrs. Hillary Clinton. So from Secretary of State, she is now reaching towards becoming almost a President of United States. So that's a good quantum positive jump. So I hope that from 7th review conference to 8th review conference, we also will see some positive and interesting changes. Well, having said that, what one should speak about BTWC? One very pessimist view is that we have been talking for all these years, same issues again and again. We are trying to reinterpret every article again and again. Nothing new is there to offer on the table. So it's just a talk shop which will go through the motions as a review conference. On the other side, one can really look at it is that now we are staying in the era of asymmetric conflict, asymmetric warfare, where you got a conventional threats are already existing. At the same time, there has been addition of asymmetric threats. Life is dynamic. Technology is changing every day and day out, again and again. So we need to look at these issues from a different perspective. I think all of us broadly agree on these sorts of things. That's why we are sitting over here to discuss this issue. When I go 5 years back, when Mrs. Clinton had addressed the BTWC, she had basically talked of two issues. One is that we should not take this threat lying down or very lightly, and other aspect which she said is about interaction at a foreign policy level. I think the second aspect is extremely important in today's days in time, particularly when you got various diseases which have been spreading from one country to other country. There is a need to have major interaction at a policy level. So if today I have to address these threats, how I look at these threats, I don't think so that there is any sort of a threat from a state actor. Could a state actor covertly support a terrorist organization? I feel that possibility is very less. On top of it, there is a possibility that there could be disgruntled scientific organizations, scientists. At the same time, there could be certain amount of accidental release of germs or other sorts of viruses from the scientific labs too. So there is a possibility exists. Religious fanatics, yes, we have seen certain amount of cases in the past, and there is a possibility that those types of things could exist. We have seen a case few years back in Norway where one individual was able to kill 77 or 78 people in one go. And when goes through the entire website of that individual, he has taken a lot amount of efforts to understand what anthrax is all about. His photographs with the masks and all those things were there. So there was a conviction at a certain extremist point of view that yes, these things are possible and it could help us to kill many amount of population. I think his prediction was that major anthrax attacks could help around 200,000 people to get killed. So there are religious fanatics. We can call them as a terrorist organization or a lone wolf attack also, that one individual is thinking something differently, something very radically, and that sort of an attack could take place. As far as terrorist organizations are concerned, I think there is a time which has come that we need to have a fresh look at it. We all know that chemical weapons was a big no-no for all these years, but now ISIS has started using them. So similarly, there are certain amount of indications that ISIS is looking at biological weapons too. So from that perspective, I think it becomes very important that we need to look at these issues freshly. Again, terrorist organizations could learn something which is happening out in the open because of the natural pandemics. You got cases like Zika, MERS, Ebola. All these incidences have shown not only to terrorists, to all of us, that there is a great amount of a danger that the entire society goes through when these sorts of threats are there. With particular cases like Zika, we have seen right from Brazil onwards till Miami, you got spread of threats which are happening. Because of globalization and other related issues, the threats are spreading one can say very routinely from one country to other country. So if a terrorist organization wants to control these sorts of weapons also, or just pick up something from the nature, it's definitely not impossible. So under these circumstances, how one should look at biotechnology? I think more than looking at a biotechnology, one has to look at an entire technology spectrum as a whole. Because there is much is spoken about biotechnology, about viruses where you can have gene weapons which are manufactured into the laboratories, so on and so forth. But there are positive aspects of various technologies which could be used from the purposes or a point of view of biosafety, biosecurity and biodefense too. So I'll just name few technologies over here. We have seen there is nothing much is known about agent defeat weapons, but we all know that during the first Gulf War and subsequently in coming years, there's a good amount of research which has happened on these issues. Then there are technologies like biotechnology, nanotechnology, basically information tools and tactics, sensors are there, robotics is also coming up in a big way which could help into biodefense. As far as information technology and biodefense is concerned, we all know that we are using information technology for routine purposes, like under Article 10 you can create a database, so on and so forth. But this technology has got more amount of a potential from medical perspective too. Then this technology could be used for the purposes of modeling and simulation, where a lot amount of activities could be worked on. you may not have a classical plume model which is usually there for any sort of a chemical attack, but definitely certain amount of a modeling could be worked out based on information technology tools, and that could be helped if there is an attack which takes place. Then for public health preparedness also, we require a lot amount of a database generation. We want to know about various activities which are taking place in terms of science and technology, particularly in the arenas of vaccine globally. So this technology could be of much use. This technology also could be used for the purposes of training tools also. Then there are virtual reality sort of a tools which are being used particularly in the US to create a synthetic theater of war-like situation. So one can create such type of a synthetic theater also where patients could be really treated if requirement is there. Then there are certain amount of trends which are being seen as far as sensor technology is concerned. There are detector technologies which are available. There are areas like command control communication, intelligence, information gathering, reconnancy, where both sensor technologies in associated with information technology could be used. People have developed certain amount of sensors which could be placed on board of UAVs or small micro vehicles which could be floating around into the air, collecting the air sample and trying to identify if there is certain amount of attack which has taken place. So there are new ideas which are emerging into biodefense weapon systems too. As far as nanotechnology is concerned, I think it's the basic key is miniaturization. It has got various amount of uses into medical sciences, sensing devices, chemical, biological, mass spectrometers for detection of biological warfare agents. Then there are single chip microchips which are also been made. Then there are small machines which could be inserted because of the nanotechnology tools, and one can really try to identify exactly how the patient who has been affected by these types of things is happening. So after having said that, what I will try to identify is that under present circumstances, these are the positive aspects as far as development of science and technology is concerned. But how should I place BTWC at the backdrop of all these things? I think we need to understand and appreciate two ground realities which may be difficult to fathom, but they are there as such. First and foremost is that we all have learned from the 5th review conference what has happened at that point in time. So any review conference now will have that sort of a thing at the backdrop, and everybody will try to see that things are only put on the paper where there is no greater amount of diversification of views within the people. So maybe instead of going for a full hog, we will try to go for slightly at a low scale. Other aspect is that we have been talking about verification protocol, verification mechanisms, but nothing much is going to emerge out of it. We all have seen for all these years, there have been certain amount of reservations by various countries, maybe to safeguard the interests of the pharmaceutical organizations or other biotechnology organizations, but this is a reality. So when we are looking at the upcoming 8th BTWC, we got to have a look at these issues, and we got to understand that under these limitations only this review conference will come out. So under these circumstances, I think the most important issue which remains over here is the issue of CBMs. I think there is a need to look at these issues at a fresh. There is a significant amount of work which has been done under CBMs, but one can really try to push this issue because this is one area which could eventually bring all people together on the table. There are other issues which are related with CBMs which are not finding place into the way the entire structure of a CBMs is there. Is particularly there are issues which are related to smallpox virus research. There are issues related to aerosols, so on and so forth. One has to give certain amount of a weightage to these issues too. Then one has to look at the agriculture threats also. There are threats like bird flu. There are incidences where the things have gone from the humans, from the birds to the humans also. So one has to look at the agriculture issues also, and certain amount of a knowledge about the veterinary vaccines and how the large scale production of plants are being taken out, how animal feed production facilities have been looked at. These issues also could be added into the CBMs. Then there could be certain amount of issues vis-a-vis the verification, which will definitely not have a sort of an agreement with various agencies. So under these circumstances, how one can bypass these issues? I think particularly the threats like viruses like Zika, even to the extent of a bird flu also, one has understood that there are various very less amount of agencies which could actually do this job. So one can think of having certain amount of a regional participation of the agencies which are already existing. That means you got agencies like SAARC, you got agencies like ASEAN which are already existing. So if some sort of a threat is being encountered over there, one can have the BSL 3, BSL 4 labs which are part of that particular region, because every country is definitely not going to have. So those countries could be tasked that if something goes wrong into your particular region, one can have a look at it. ISU issue has already been raised. I fully agree that we need to do something more as far as ISU is concerned. In case of a disease outbreak, whether it is deliberate or natural outbreak, they need to have a role for ISU over here. Then there are a few other things which have been put on the table. Particularly India has put two things. One is that one has to create a database the way it has been done for Article 10. On the similar lines, it has to be done by Article 7 also. So these are the ideas which are there. Then there is the idea of a scientific advisory board under OPCW. This board, as far as BTWC is concerned, has not given very satisfactory results. Can we repeat the same sort of idea, strengthening ISO further to look at a scientific advisory board as far as BTWC is concerned? One can learn from the experiences of OPCW in Syria and try to put them into context as far as BWC is concerned. There are again few ideas which have been given about strengthening of Article 3. Then there are various few ideas which are already there. I will not get into the details of it. Public health participation. Then there are few ideas which are related to development of a global health security agenda. I think these ideas are come from the basically from industry point of view or a biotechnology organization's point of view. So today I can say that as compared to 2011, we are technologically slightly more superior. So one has to look at what are the advantages which the technology is giving, at the same time how these advantages could be misused by the terrorist organizations. Other way to look at it is that terrorist organizations are not looking at technology. Right now, if they have to launch an attack, they will look for more rudimentary technologies, but one has to respond to all those things by using greater amount of technologies. While ending, I don't want to say it, but let's discuss compliance. I think that is what is more important. I think enough amount of work has been already done as far as the upcoming review conference is concerned. We need to have the ground game correctly. I think that will give certain amount of success for the upcoming BTWC. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ajay, for your very realistic assessment of the BTWC state of play of discussions against the backdrop of the new technology and science developments. Also through the focus of the risk of terrorists acquiring and also using biological agents as weapon. So let me now move to Jean-Pascal Zanders and his presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak in this panel. I want to give a couple of reflections. I'm going to start off with the title of this particular session. When I saw it, Maintaining Relevance, I was kind of wondering, is the relevance of the BTWC sinking one way or another? Is this treaty in jeopardy or whatever? And I wonder, there is a certain feeling always going around, this is a weak treaty, it's a mantra that goes on. And then my immediate reaction is always, well, by what criteria are we talking about a weak treaty? If I now throw out here, right now, Chemical Weapons Convention, supposedly a strong treaty, verification regime, everything on it, but in its almost 20 years of existence, we probably have about 2,000 fatalities as a consequence of chemical warfare and terrorism. If we look at the BTWC, of course, no international organization, no verification, whatever, 41 years in existence, but fewer than 100 persons killed through the use of deliberate disease or toxins. So what do we say about a treaty? The other thing to bear in mind is if one looks at the BTWC, it's actually a very active treaty. Since 1991, the third review conference, states parties have come together in Geneva at least twice a year ever since 1991. Sometimes it was more, particularly during the negotiation of the legally binding protocol in the 1990s and early 2000s. Of course, there is a lot of frustration with the formal process. But in contrast to that, one can actually see a lot of activity going on the local and the sub-regional levels of activity. This is where I would like to focus the remainder of my comments. Between March and the end of September of this year, I had the honor, the privilege, and the anxiety of assisting the implementation support unit of the BTWC with the implementation of the first part of the European Union Council decision 2016-51 in support of the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention. And that entailed the organization of 4 regional, sub-regional meetings in different parts of the world. And what came out of these meetings was quite remarkable in a number of ways. If one participates in the meetings on science and technology review, developments in terms of industrial capacity, new production processes and technologies, you know, there's a lot of anxiety. It's always talk in terms of threats to the convention and possibly weakening of the norm. However, if one looks at a number of states we visited, and India was a prime example, and you know, everybody sitting behind this table was part of that Biological Weapons World Tour 2016. But if we went look at India, I remember still at the 30th anniversary of the BTWC in 2005 that I organized a conference in Geneva. We had an Indian scientist present, and she was referring to the fact that India was actually at the point of becoming a net exporter of biotechnology, whereas before it was a net importer. And she predicted that with that transition, India would assume new types of responsibilities to govern that new science, the new technologies. So there I was in August in Delhi, and a discussion started up, and actually it was interesting to see the evolution in, for example, India's export control legislation, how it had adopted a number of principles that only 10 years ago were extremely controversial internationally. The same has happened with China. It's not just that there is an evolution in terms of national policies and also the adoption of a certain rationale behind these policies. At the same time, one can also see that the convergence of ideas, the convergence of approaches between states in different parts of the world actually lead to situations where cross-continental, cross-regional cooperation in a number of issues becomes possible. And if you check out the website of the Implementation Support Unit of the UN organization in Geneva, what you're going to see are actually a number of working papers written by European and Asian states, European and South American states, United States with partners in different regions. And it's part of the possibilities that are emerging, which perhaps do not yet translate into formal agreements or formal new understandings. But in the practice, it's coming there. It is very much alive. A second aspect, if one thinks of Article 10 of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention in terms of international cooperation, usually a hugely controversial article, just like Article 11 of the Chemical Weapons Convention. But, you know, since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War and today, there too there has been enormous development. On two levels, I would say. The first one, which really struck me during the various regional meetings, was actually while in Geneva, states parties to the BTWC discuss Article 10 almost bloc against bloc in general abstract principles, very rarely concrete proposals or requests for concrete proposals. What happens on the regional, sub-regional level is that certain states that have taken the lead in technology, science development and so forth actually start processes under Article 10 to transfer the knowledge and the practices to neighboring states. So in other words, concretely, on the regional level, we see patterns of cooperation, of training, of education emerging that are very explicitly done under Article 10. Argentina plays such a role for South America. We see similar things happening in the context of ASEAN, particularly in the area of biorisk management. So again, we see something happening there. I have mentioned in Geneva the abstract nature of many of the debates. On the regional level, what we see is actually very concrete assistance. The elements that come to the fore, I've already mentioned biorisk management, but it's also on the level of national implementation assistance with the fulfillment of the CBM obligations and so forth. Related to that, not specifically Article 10, but the activity taking place on the regional level in different regions. Was it, Eastern Europe, Central Asia? Was it Southeast Asia and or Latin America? One could see the emergence of what I would call a regional identity, something that several of the states participating in the seminars wish to express, wish to develop and articulate more clearly in the forums in Geneva, whether it's the review conference and so on. There is still a bit of reluctance in a number of areas, but definitely that came to the fore. In the context of Latin America, particularly for those of you who remember the 2006 review conference, when new informal groupings popped up. There was the group of the Latin American countries that made a number of proposals as a collective. We had the Jacksons. And the interesting part of that was a number of the papers, let's say, presented by the traditional antagonists in Geneva, were like the outlying propositions. But then the ones that were presented by either Jacksons or Latin America kind of became the center around which everything started to gyrate at a point and had a certain impact. Is that something that right now we might see coming again with a greater regional activity, that we see the breakdown of the three big Cold War blocs that still exist in the BTWC forums? A third element that came to fore, I've already alluded to that, is the disconnect between delegations in Geneva and the desk officers in capitals. These are, in many cases, we've seen two completely different worlds. The people on both sides of the communication have different frameworks, and when the people from Geneva try to obtain instructions from capital doesn't understand the question. Many people from the countries that we targeted in those meetings, they find the debates in Geneva are very abstract, and from capital they don't get concrete instructions in terms of putting forward concrete elements. So the debates can remain very abstract and antagonistic, as they were always, simply because of lack of such communication. And that need how to express oneself in Geneva for many of the states parties in the regions we visited is actually an important point that we should further investigate and elaborate to see how certain types of assistance activities can be organized. A fourth element actually pertains very specifically to Africa. You may have noticed that so far in my presentations I haven't yet touched upon Africa, and there were a couple of interesting aspects I noticed, but mostly because they were absent compared to what I've observed in the other regions. The first one is there are a number of countries on the African continent that clearly are leaders in terms of biology, life sciences, biotechnology, and I would say South Africa, Kenya, Morocco are among them. But from these three countries, there is no radiation to neighboring countries or within the region. So what we could notice in Southeast Asia or in Latin America simply doesn't happen. And when in the final session in Addis Ababa, I was asked by one of the participants to compare the three regions, people were actually surprised to learn that, but also acknowledged that it was the case. So definitely there would be a great interest in stimulating the more advanced countries to engage sub-regionally or regionally in that way. Another element we had in Africa was unawareness, lack of awareness of the BTWC, even among the people who were sent by their government to attend those meetings. And in one particular case, I have to say, it was a non-state party, but the question even came up, well, why should we not use biological weapons? The country it's a country at war, and there was no sense of the normative framework that governs international relations, international security. It's also the continent with the largest number of non-state parties still with the BTWC, and a lot of activity has to be done. It was really good to notice in different interventions that the African Union is starting to take up the BTWC as a priority issue, and hopefully they will be present next week at the review conference. So it would be good for representatives of states parties to interact with the representatives of the African Union, because they want to set up programs to stimulate universality, including what I personally call qualitative universality. That's the quality of national implementation of the obligations inside states parties. And then there is something which I don't know whether this is entirely politically correct, but I'm speaking in my own name, so what the heck. But I noticed a bit difference between the Anglophone and the Francophone countries in attitude towards the treaty, where generally representatives from Anglophone countries were quite well aware of issues, and Francophone countries far less. And based on that observation, I have spoken with representatives from both linguistic communities, and on both sides they kind of acknowledged that as a fact. Question is, if we are talking about assistance programs or outreach programs to these countries, perhaps what needs to be done is some preliminary investigation to see what the causes are of that particular discrepancy. Is it a fact that, like at this particular meeting, it's very easy to speak in English and do everything in English, but nothing equivalent is being done on the Francophone level, so that general awareness and knowledge is lower? Is it because that in the Francophone group fewer activities take place? I have no idea. I was just struck by the fact that actually the people from the region themselves acknowledge that it's not some sort of stupid prejudice on my side. Then my final point, the fifth point, is if I look at this, there are definitely a whole number of issues that should be thought through fundamentally in terms of how to organize assistance and support for the different regions. There are a number of trends taking place that are very interesting, very supportive of the norm that's embedded in the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, and it's a feeling of how can we stimulate it further without being too intrusive in what I would call natural processes in the region. And here we have to see assistance. One element to look at to engender interest in the BTWC is not to depart in those regions from the BTWC. The perspective on the relevancy of an international convention such as the BTWC in other parts of the world might be quite different from the way we look at it in North America and Europe, which has a very strong law-based attitude to international relations. It could also be that we encounter situations where some of the issues, such as terrorism, for example, are not that salient in the minds of the people there. However, they may be more interested in biological diversity. They might be more interested in the impact of genetically modified organisms on their environment, their economy, things like that. And perhaps strategies need to be developed that those local points of interest as a starting point to shift and expand the knowledge about the BTWC and relate the many things that are being discussed under the BTWC, that they actually have relevancy to the world as local people perceive them. And then a final point, and that's perhaps something more to the European Union, to the External Action Service to say. I think the centers of excellence that operate in different parts of the world, including Africa, will actually be a very good point of activity, and perhaps also try to see in terms of activities. I've already mentioned the African Union, but I think also the UN regional centers, to give them the capacity to conduct a series of activities specifically focused on the BTWC. That might actually be quite useful, because these people, more than we ever can do, actually depart from the local reality. And with that, Emil, I will end.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal, for this very comprehensive presentation based almost entirely on your very rich insight from the EU-funded regional workshops. And just to pick up your last point, indeed we see a very important role of the Centers of Excellence in the implementation strategy of the Council decision. We have submitted as European Union a working paper outlining the support provided by the EU member states, but also by the EU institutions, including through the Centers of Excellence under Article 10. This is one of the modest contributions the European Union has made to the preparations for the review conference. And just another point, as far as I'm personally concerned, I feel myself entirely connected to the delegation in Geneva. We are in constant touch with our colleagues in Geneva, especially in this very busy context of the preparations of the review conference. With this, colleagues, let me, without further ado, proceed to the questions and answers session, but just to make a couple of housekeeping remarks. This session is on record, so please introduce yourself when asking questions by name and affiliation, and please speak into the microphone. Thank you very much. The first question, the lady on the third row.
Thank you. My name is Paula Vanninen. I'm from Merithin, from University of Helsinki, and I'm a chemist. Actually, when I'm listening to your talks, it seems to be that BTWC is very strong convention. So could you, at least each of you, tell one thing what is missing? And perhaps you don't have to go to the declarations and verification issues, which are very important for the Chemical Weapons Convention. And then I think that you were touching, Jean-Pascal, very important issue. What is the norm? I think that for the older people, it seems to be totally clear. But what about youngsters? Do they understand what is the norm not to use chemical weapons or biological weapons? I think that perhaps you should take actions on this, because it's not the norm for the youngsters. It's those ones who have lived that and have more historical background have this type of thinking.
Thank you very much. I'll take two more questions and then go back to the presenters. Sir, please.
I'm Professor Derdour. I am the Executive Secretary of the African Commission of Nuclear Energy. But I don't speak as an Executive Secretary, but I speak about a former member of biological and chemical members in my country, Algeria. The first in Biology Convention, there is no binding legal provision, measures, and norms to force a country to implement that convention. That does it mean there is nobody in charge to take implementation, control, verification of that milestone in that convention, as does IEA in non-proliferation, the Organization of Chemical and Chemicals, and CTBT once the CTBTO once the CTBT in force. The weakness in this convention is that it is not binding, and this convention, he don't institute to create a body in charge verification if there is any binding milestones in the convention. Now, about the second remarks of Zanders about the culture between French and English. First, there is a difference in culture attitude of peoples due to the pragmatic spirits of English and the Latin and, if I say Byzantine, spirits of the French one. Second, the main weakness is that the IP cultures is not so diffused in these countries. The one IP is very strong, like in South Africa, we have also a strong development of this. The other countries, the IP is very weak, and mainly the IP regarding the biological issues, because in the biological issues, there, European and England and UK and US, they patent all biological, but in Europe is another convention and so on. And I can speak a lot about IP cultures in Africa. But if you kick about the door of EU, you are wrong. because AU now, if you can kick the website of AU is down. 15 days, my email box AU is off. Does it mean AU needs to be reformed and to look to benchmark AU systems? Because African Union make good resolution, make concretization for themselves. There is no binding like in in EU directive, which is binding applied to each state. This is the difference. What does it mean? If you want to work with Africa, if you want to kick African Union, you have to reform African Union, because a very young lady, but like Dolly, he has the gene of his mother, and he has all the sickness of his mother's, but he is very young. The second, I finished that.
Yeah.
Just thank you.
Do you have a specific question to the speakers?
No, I haven't. I have just to highlight some.
Thank you.
Because
Thank you
I know
very
very
much
well
for
the
your opinion.
African system, the African country, the AU, and so on. What make contribution to this?
The
Thank
last
you.
row, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Richard Guthrie, CBW Events. I'll stand up since I'm hidden at the back. I want to follow up on what Jean-Pascal was saying in identifying, you were suggesting you had identified a disconnect between delegates and their governments. I think I would interpret that a little bit differently, and so I think this is worth teasing out because this may have some implications for the forthcoming review conference. I think I would agree with you that there is a disconnect between people who have got a speciality or a focus on the BWC and some of the broader governmental officials. I think it is quite, you're correct in saying there's some quite esoteric arguments that are perceived. I wonder how we might overcome this. Now, one is that I think we're failing in that we don't really identify BWC alumni. There are a lot of people who've come through dealing with the BWC, have slowly risen through their government systems, and we're not keeping track of them. I think it would actually be very useful because it can be quite a difficult subject to brief people on because there are a diverse range of issues that come up with the BWC that it might be worth us looking at that. The second is on the Francophone Africa thing, on the daily reports, and I give the daily reports a plug. If you've not signed up for the new mailing list, please do so, come and find me. One of the requests I did have in the past was, could these be translated into French simply because there is a difficulty of good material, good, shall we say, generalist material, or material that generalists can access that outline the issues that are something like the BWC, because there is a lot of very dry, very technical material that is quite difficult for the generalist to get hold of, and I wonder whether that's also a symptom of what you're identifying. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you very much, colleagues, for your questions. Let us now try to give your answers to these questions. Just to remind, the first question was on about the weaknesses of the BTWC, at least one weakness to be signaled, and then the issue of let me check about the norm, exactly about the norm. Then the issue of verification, again the lack of verification, and the last Richard's question about the need to keep track of experts in the BTWC overall field. So, colleagues, the floor is yours. Who would like? Jean-Pascal.
Well, thank you very much for the questions and the comments. And yes, I mean, most of what was said, I mean, is kind of confirmation of my own experiences. Let me take a little bit. I think what Richard touched upon is absolutely pertinent. It's to have a number of basic materials available. They should be available in different languages so that they can be reached out. The core problem is that again, there is no centralized organization to support the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention. If I compare the regime development of the BTWC with the CWC, many of the issues that were controversial during the negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention and during the PrepCon phase, if one compares the late 90s with today, the mere fact that the organization was able to stimulate certain programs, it actually overcame many of the differences that existed between. For certain things, the political angle has been diffused, definitely. So, yes, I think there is a real need to set up a process of both education and outreach. Education in terms of basic knowledge and training experience, and outreach to draw in more communities from the different parts of the world into the BTWC process. The other thing, perhaps to say, I was entrusted with the implementation of the very first European Union joint action in 2006, before the ISU existed. If I compare the situation, particularly in Africa, there is also a big evolution over the past 10 years. When I was organizing events in Africa, a person was contacted through the foreign ministry. That person in the foreign ministry was like in a single pipe, no colleagues on the same level. It was like desk officer, superior, director general, or whatever. And that person had no lateral contacts, even with equivalent functions in other ministries. Today, you can clearly see that all the countries we have contacted for the meetings this year were aware that different ministries had to be involved, different agencies had to be involved, and that many of those lateral contacts had been established. So it's another point of evidence of how on the local, sub-regional level things are actually advancing. More importantly, people are aware of their equivalent colleagues in other countries. It's one of the reasons why in different meetings we emphasize the need to have a national contact point for the BTWC, a focal point, so that people could interact even more laterally. The last point I would like to take up in the comments is about verification. Paula and I were going to discuss the norm. I mean, we can spend many weeks, months on that one. But on verification, if you make the comparison with IAEA or CTBT or CWC, I think for the BTWC we have to depart from a completely different perspective, and perhaps not the declaration inspection-based type of system, but rather something that functions more on having the relevant facilities meet certain standards and verify whether the standards are being met. So it's more or less a process similar by the International Organization for Standards, ISO, undertaken. And just look at what ISO does to assist countries and economic units inside the countries meet the ISO standards. They develop so many activities that one could consider as Article 10 type of activities under the BTWC. A different type of issue that is starting to bubble up in the context of the future of the BTWC in Geneva is audit-based approaches to verification, where people actually start monitoring and looking into the activities and start detecting anomalies. As soon as there is an anomaly, one starts to dig deeper into why that anomaly exists. It's something similar, but it's a different approach than trying to testify to the presence of the absence of a particular type of technology in a specific location at a particular time. It's more process oriented. And we have to harness all the new technologies, all the new types of information we have available about institutions, scientific organizations, industry, and so forth. So, this is something that really deserves deep reflection. I personally don't think that, the old idea of copying the CWC verification system into the BTWC is the right approach. I already started doubting it in 99, 2000, because it dealt with yesterday's problems, not the ones that are coming towards us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. Tanya.
Thank you so much. Two very quick points. One is about the BTWC and what is missing. And in a way to echo what Jean-Pascal says, in my opinion, what is missing is coordination. There's a lot of great work happening on the ground, and those who have been involved in biosecurity and biological non-proliferation and disarmament over the years, they know that there are a lot of NGOs, there are a lot of organizations, there's a lot of excellent work going on in terms of not only raising awareness, but engaging industry, trying to engage different stakeholders, developing standards, so on and so forth. The problem is that there is no coordination. So in a way, one hand doesn't know what the other is doing. And very often it happens that one and the same different donors fund projects and priorities in one and the same region or one and the same country. And that leads to problems. People get overwhelmed with a lot of work, and it's very difficult to keep track of what is actually happening on the ground. So better coordination of projects, of activities, that would help overcome some of the limitations. In terms of the norm and actions for engaging the younger generation, by all means, yes, education and awareness raising, and those of you who are familiar with the work in Bradford, you would know that for the past 8 years, we have been actively involved in promoting education awareness raising on biosecurity. And this year, we run a seminar with kids as young as 16, 17 years of age, and to demonstrate whether they can be actively engaged with biosecurity through the prism of responsible science. And the main question was, what does it mean to be a responsible scientist in 21st century? It's not a matter about what is a biological weapon or what is a chemical weapon. It's more about responsibility in 21st century. And I think that that's, from an educational point of view, I think that's a better approach to reach out not only to younger generation, but also to practicing researchers and scientists in academia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ajay, please.
I think what is missing or is already been brought out. I entirely agree with Jean-Pascal that verification protocol per se is not the last word. But only advantage with the verification protocol sort of a mechanism gives is there is an interest of an industry. As far as chemical weapons are concerned, there is good amount of an interest of an industry which is slightly missing as far as biotechnology industries are concerned. So that is one area which is missing. Other area, as it has been rightly pointed out, you don't have IAEA or OPCW sort of organization. It is jokingly said by a few people that ISU has got 1.5 people working on it. So there is no sort of a support which is out there. And one interesting aspect which comes to my at least notice is that when you talk of nuclear, you got 5,000 NGOs which are working. When you talk of biological, you got one BWPP or Trend or somebody who are working. So there is no much amount of awakening in form of NGOs. What happens is that the advantage of an NGO, there are a lot of disadvantages, but advantage of an NGO is that it makes media aware, and fortunately or unfortunately, subsequently it makes the politicians aware. And the funding comes usually because of these reasons. This is what I feel is missing.
Thank you very much. Just a short addition to this. Indeed, the lack of verification is a reality on the ground, and we can also see it from another point of view. It's as a reality on the ground, it's triggering a lot of mitigating initiatives, additional measures to reinforce the implementation and the effectiveness of the convention. So in this context, there are a lot of ideas on the table. There are a lot of working papers. In particular, we as a European Union have submitted a working paper very recently on how to reinforce the consultative mechanism provisions in the BTWC, but this is only one of the working papers that have been submitted in this direction. So one can also see it from a positive point of view, probably. Another round of questions. The floor is yours, colleagues. For another questions. Please, the microphone is yours.
Good evening. I'm a government relations professional. I represent rather the private sector. And I would like to ask a question in this respect, given that the industry has a role, especially in the supply chain, and also in a globalized world in the failed states, I think the industry can be even more important in contributing. So my question is, are you satisfied with the dialogue that is taking place right now between, on the one state, the government actors that are trying to improve the convention and the industry, and on the other hand, if you foresee any changes in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes, Mr. Delou, please, once again.
Yeah, just to contribute to this debate, because for me, as I am a former member of biological and chemicals and nuclear in my former country, I would like to say what relationship between this convention and that convention of vegetable variety. Is there vegetable variety? There is a convention called Convention on the Vegetable Varieties. So that convention is a specific convention. If you want to be a party, there is some request to be in. And this is very important to protect all the patrimony of the genetics of vegetable in many countries, and mainly in Africa. It's a very specific convention on vegetable varieties. It is not like this, you have to be a party, but the convention will have mandate, and of this convention has a prerequisite to the country to be member of this convention, and they play a great role in the conservation of all the patrimony, genetic patrimony in many countries. So in Africa, as you tell Zanders, there is the weakness of the IP. IP is very important in Africa, and mainly in French country too, because there is no culture. Why there is a culture of IP? Because the regime are socialist, and in the socialism system, the IP is property of the states, not of the IP. So I think if you push to move up upgrade the IP levels in these countries, we can move up somewhere all the issue regarding to take care to all the biological ecosystems. I speak ecosystems, not only varieties and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Delou, for your further contribution to this debate. Next question. If not, let me allow speakers, panelists to reply to your question. In particular, the question on on the relation of the interaction rather between industry and non-government stakeholders with the BTWC community. Yes, Tatiana.
Thank you so much. When you look at the BTWC process, industry does feature. They do bio, for instance. They do come to the meetings. They address the conference. They have side events. So in a way, they are there. They are present. The problem is that whether the relationship is as active as it can be, the answer, of course, is that there is room for improvement and that there are ways of how this can be improved. Hopefully, one possible scope for improvement would be the introduction of an internationally recognized standard of biorisk management, and that is the CEN agreement that is currently being converted into an ISO, and it should soon be made available as an ISO standard. So that would be effectively a standard that not only private but also public laboratories and companies would require if they're doing anything with biological materials. Also, when you look at the International Federation of Biosafety Associations, they have recently launched a certification program, and it's an international certification program for professionals. And they have a number of different specialties, categories for becoming a professional, and biosecurity is one. And if you want to qualify for a biosecurity professional, then you would require to have some awareness of the different agreements, including the BTWC, but also the Chemical Weapons Convention, of dual use, of bioethics, of the WHO standards, and so on and so forth. So in a way, there are initiatives that are made available to the life science community writ large, including industry. And it's one way industry can also take advantage. And once they take advantage, it's of course would be highly desirable for firms and for associations to come and brief the states parties that their activities taking place. It's a two-way process. So it's about states parties sitting in Geneva and making decisions, but it's also about industry flagging up that, okay, we are taking care, we are doing these activities, we are participating, we want to be engaged. So in that sense, it's a two-way process. And the question about the conventional and vegetable variety, well, one of my colleagues, he would use the phrase a web of prevention. And by a web of prevention, what he says is that in order to have a strong biological and toxin weapons convention, we need a whole web of different preventive policies. And that would include interaction with different international regimes, including, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the different WHO standards, national export control policies, intelligence would count to that, biosecurity, biosafety. So in a way, all regimes, all different agreements that are there, and when you look at the biotechnology governance regime, you would see that there are something like 33, if I'm not mistaken, international organizations that are in one way or another involved in the governance of biotechnology on international scale. So it's a densely populated landscape, and there are a lot of different agreements. And when you mentioned intellectual property, there is a host of different intellectual property rules, not only the ones under the World Trade Organization, there is also the Convention on Plant Variety, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of those, and states have to implement all of them. And the thing is that implementing any of those provisions and all of those regimes contributes one way or another to preventing, in a way, and fulfilling the objectives of this regime of securing the biotechnology. The biotechnology is used only for peaceful purposes, which is at the heart of the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Yeah, just
One small point as far as industry is concerned, there is something like laboratory biosafety and biosecurity. There industry plays an important role. Other area where industry could be engaged is as far as your naturally occurring diseases are concerned, because there are few, at least from the part of the world which I come, where industry feels that particularly in regards to vaccine development and other areas, they are not given that much amount of one can say assistance, or they are not encouraged that much to get into all these sorts of business. So when they become a part of the entire gamut, I think they will have a more constructive role in BTWC.
Thank you. And if allow me at the end just to provide you with a bit of additional information, During the course of next year, the ISU in Geneva will organize 5 more workshops, regional workshops, this time focused not only on the preparations for the review conference, but on stimulating interaction and exchanges between industry, non-governmental experts and policymakers in the field of science and technology. This could be a good opportunity, in fact, to advance in the area of science technology, the interrelation between all stakeholders. Colleagues, with this, I take further questions. Yes, Mr. Delo, for follow-up comment.
Just give this assistance my back experiences about this biologicals in comparison to chemicals and nuclears. For chemicals, we have inter-ministerial committees, executive secretary. The convention is binding, signed, ratified, and projected in the law, national law, and decree, and so on. Nuclear also, we are member of the NPT, member of the CTBT. We sign many conventions, so we internalize and project all this treaty and convention in national law. But for biological, as it is not binding, there is no structure that obliges the state to have this, because we need to project this to articulate according to what is binding in the convention. So the biological has nobody to implement this, so it is not well taken. It is taken in charge, but it is not well taken in charge as nuclear and chemicals one. Thank you.
Thank you once again. I see now reactions in the panel. Tatiana first, and then Jean-Pascal.
Thank you so much. Just one quick point about the BTWC. Actually, if a state is a state party to the convention, that means that if a state has signed and ratified the convention, that means the convention is legally binding. And also such states also need to provide a national focal point or contact point, which is usually it's a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or a Ministry of Defense who is responsible on national level for collecting information and actually implementing the convention. So are coordinating activities related to the convention, but the convention is binding. If a state is a state party to the Biological Toxic Weapons Convention, it's a binding document. Just want to make this clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Pascal, please.
Yes, I fully agree with Tatiana too. The BTWC is an international convention, and states parties must be in compliance. And while it is true that there may not be an international organization to oversee implementation, there is the collectivity of states parties. The ownership is with the states parties. If there is an international organization, be also aware that many states parties don't assume many of their obligations because they think the international organization can do it. In the BTWC, the dynamic is sometimes quite different than what we may see when there is an international organization. But I would like to link that a bit to your question about globalization. And in certain ways, again, while BTWC institutionally is perceived to be very weak, I sometimes wonder if actually it's not better equipped to meet the challenges of the future, because instead of having fixed institutions with agreements that states parties are always extremely reluctant to modify even a comma in a sentence, so to speak, in the BTWC, the possibility exists to move towards a format of governance, and a format of governance that would involve states, among others. It would also involve responsibilities by industry, scientific community, civil society, and so forth. There are a number of ways, and when I was, if I look back at some of my writings around 2006 and later, I was actually constructing possible models of how the governance aspect could go. But that has a bit evaporated recently. And one of the reasons why, and this is also something we need to factor in when thinking about the future of the convention. You used the term globalization, and I attach to that a different concept of polycentrism. And polycentrism is understood that the levels of decision making are layered vertically from civil society, individual companies, to the state level, international organization, transnational organizations or corporations. And each of them have a major impact on the way we look at the BTWC, and they all have their own interest. However, in polycentrism, the other aspect you have is that you get more regional centers of decision making. In other words, we already see that certain interactions become much more intense within a region or a sub-region, and very often we can already see the germs of, well, excuse the pun, but we can already see the germs of what I would say, development of relatively autonomous sets of values and expectations and so on. In other words, we could come to a situation of regional fragmentation, which then, of course, we have to ask, where do we go with the norm embedded in the BTWC? In other words, it challenges the concept of universality in a certain way. Also, if we involve different types of stakeholders, somehow we often assume that they would all be pulling the rope in the same direction. But that's not necessarily the case. They have different interests. There are going to be conflicts of interest. In certain situations, we're going to see a synthesis coming out of that, but in other areas it's simply going to pull fabric apart. And it's probably that type of dynamic environment that we have to capture in trying to understand what the future of treaties such as the BTWC is going to be. But yeah, I mean, in the context of the OPCW, I'm involved in developing strategies for reaching out to a variety of stakeholders and try to get them actively involved in the treaty regime. Again, the advantage is there is an OPCW, and you can get all the people come to that organization, even if one reaches out on the regional or the sub-regional level. In the BTWC, we will have to find ways of dealing with that, of course.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pascal. I think we couldn't have a more appropriate conclusion of our discussion tonight. Having reached the time limit of our discussion, I would like to thank once again our speakers, to thank you for your involvement, and to express our hope for a successful outcome of the review conference, which will be in any event a reality check of our discussion. Thank you very much once again.